Banqueting House, Westminster Central, London, Tuesday, 30 January 1649, 2 p.m. 48-year-old Charles Stuart, first of his name, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, steps through a large picture window and down a temporary flight of stairs onto a wooden scaffold, where he says a few words to the assembled crowd, then kneels down and lays his head upon a wooden block where it is promptly severed from his body with one blow of the executioner's axe. And though it's been 374 years since it happened, if you took a poll of modern-day Britons, they would probably still rate the execution of Charles I as the darkest and most shocking event in the long history of their nation. It would be in the top 3 in any event. Even on the day, even as the king's head was rolling upon the ground, the reaction of the crowd was starkly different to the normal reaction to public executions in those days. There was no exultant cheering, no chants about tyrants getting their just deserts. The headsman himself even refrained from the traditional cry of, "Behold the head of a traitor!" According to all the contemporary descriptions of the event that still exist, the only reaction from the crowd was gasping and moaning, followed by stunned, awestruck silence. And why was everybody so stunned? Because nobody thought the king was actually going to be executed. Charles himself may have been the only man in the country who knew he was really about to perish. Even Oliver Cromwell and the 58 other men who signed the king's death warrant didn't think the sentence was really going to be carried out. From the first moments of his trial, all the way to the last moment his head remained attached to his shoulders, Charles retained the option of pleading for mercy and having his life spared, and even remaining on the throne. And nobody expected him to not take the opportunity. And then all of a sudden, in one sickening moment, as the monarch's disembodied head was being bundled into a black velvet bag, the whole country seemed to realize, holy shit, we've just killed the king. What the hell happens now? And that's the real question, isn't it? But it hadn't occurred to anybody to ask it. The whole point of putting the king on trial and passing a death sentence on him was to impel him to admit his mistakes and agree to become what we would call today a constitutional monarch. Cromwell and his Roundheads didn't even want to abolish the monarchy. They didn't even want to replace the current king. They were more than happy to let Charles remain on the throne in return for some political concessions on his part. But then the king called their bluff. He laid his head on the block and gave the signal for the executioner to strike. And it didn't take the country and its leaders very long to realize they'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. Now, it would take a whole series of videos to go through all the particulars of the events that led up to the English Civil War, and which culminated with the trial and beheading of an anointed king. But we'll go over some of it in the main segment. The reason I bring this story up today is because it provides, I think, a powerful object lesson in what can happen when you become singularly focused on bringing down one man. Maybe it starts out with a legitimate desire for justice, but then it turns into a maniacal, single-minded obsession, bringing the bad man to heel, making him an object of public humiliation, becomes such an all-consuming objective that you don't notice when you start trampling on all the institutional norms that you claim to value. You don't consider the unintended consequences of the course of action you've chosen. You never contemplate how the thing you're trying to do to this guy may very well come back to bite you in your own ass twice as hard. And you haven't given a single thought to what comes afterward when and if the goal is realized. In fact, you might say Cromwell and the parliamentarians were suffering from an acute case of Charles Derangement syndrome. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where our tavern is a judgment-free zone serving roundheads and cavaliers alike. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I'm your eponymous host and humble servant. And to understand the antipathy that existed toward King Charles I, you have to go back to the reign of his father, James VI of Scotland and the First of England, who came to the English throne in 1603 upon the death of the childless Elizabeth I and the consequent extinction of the Tudor dynasty, having already been King of Scots for 36 years by that point, ever since his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, had been forced to abdicate the throne in his favor when James was barely 1 year old. As for the English people, While they were appreciative of the fact that the succession had been settled without the country descending into chaos and anarchy, they were not quite so crazy about having a Scottish king, especially a Scottish king who was loud, garrulous, uncouth, and openly homosexual, who only shared his wife's bed often enough to produce some heirs and continue the royal line. Charles was the second son, the spare to the heir, to use our preferred modern parlance. Born in Scotland in 1600, 3 years before his father ascended the English throne and moved the family down to London. He spends the first 12 years of his life not ever expecting to become king, until the sudden death of his elder brother, Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, in November of 1612. Charles thus becomes the heir apparent, which he remains until his father's death 13 years later on 27 March 1623, whereupon he assumes the throne as King Charles I. 2 years later, he weds the younger sister of the King of France, the scandalously Catholic Princess Henrietta Maria. Now, it's impossible to overstate the importance of religion in the course of political events during this time period. We are only a century removed at this point from the English Reformation, when Henry VIII got butthurt that the Pope wouldn't grant him a divorce, and he decided to just do an end round around the problem by removing his kingdom from the auspices of the Catholic Church and establishing the Church of England in its place. But Scotland, being still a separate country with a separate monarch, remains Catholic for the time being. The Scottish Reformation doesn't happen until 1560, 26 years after the English Reformation, and the Church of Scotland, being heavily influenced in its founding by the principles of Calvinism, takes on a much less, shall we say, Catholic-adjacent liturgical character than does the Church of England. By the time Charles comes to the throne of the now unified kingdom, the English people are deeply distrustful of anything associated with Catholicism, or popery, as they called it in those days. And the Scottish people are deeply distrustful of anything associated with Anglicanism, which they still consider, due to some of its flashier accoutrements, a little bit too close to Catholicism for comfort. So when Charles becomes the king and then marries a Catholic princess, well, the English people view him as a second-generation Scottish interloper whose devotion to Anglicanism can't necessarily be trusted. And the Scottish people, meanwhile, view him as a foreign despot who wants to ruin the independence of their church and bring it into communion with the English state religion. So in a certain sense, the guy is pretty much screwed from the outset, no matter what he does. But he still commits an alarming number of unforced errors. Unusually for that period, his marriage to Henrietta Maria is a true love match. They get along fabulously. They are mutually devoted to one another, and she becomes one of the king's closest advisors. But much of her advice he would have been better off not heeding, particularly on the religion front, because Henrietta Maria thinks it's very important that the Anglican Church be brought more closely in line with Catholic doctrine and liturgy, and she convinces Charles to go along with it. And this causes paroxysms of terror in England and Scotland alike. The English begin to suspect that they've got a secretly Catholic king, and the Scots are resistant to the imposition of an Anglican church that they view as increasingly Catholic adjacent. So nobody is happy, and everybody in both countries is highly suspicious about the king's true intentions. And this was one of the things that turned Oliver Cromwell from a polite contrarian into a seditious revolutionary. He enters his local parish church one Sunday and sees that the sparse furnishings on the high altar have been replaced with ornate gilded crosses and candlesticks and so forth, all of which he proceeds to smash to smithereens in front of the entire horrified congregation, after which he openly curses the name of the king, which is an act of high treason, punishable by being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The proximate causes of the Civil War, they weren't only religious, of course. Charles, being a king from an imported royal house, he's still got a view of monarchy that's much more closely aligned with the way they view things in continental Europe, that kings rule by divine right, their power is absolute and unreviewable, and they are not subject to any constraints or limitations imposed upon them by any parliament or any damn other thing. And he's got his French Catholic wife constantly whispering in his ear, reinforcing that view. And this is a radical departure for England, where for the last 400 years, ever since Magna Carta, They've had some nascent form of constitutional monarchy in place where the powers of the king are not absolute and have to be exercised within certain statutorial constraints that are established by Parliament. Charles wants no part of this arrangement. The way he views things, when the king wants to raise an army and fight a war, it is Parliament's job to rubber stamp the venture and give him however many men and however much money he demands. Charles finds this all very annoying indeed, so he decides, screw it. Parliament can't assemble without a royal decree from me, and there's no legal requirement that they have to assemble at all. So if I don't have a war I need to finance, I will just leave Parliament on the sidelines and rule personally as the absolute monarch that God made me, which he proceeds to do for a full 11 years. So between the religion thing and the Parliament thing and a series of failed but disastrously expensive foreign military adventures, by the start of the 1640s, the fuse on the national powder keg is growing shorter and shorter, and Cromwell and the parliamentarians are becoming increasingly convinced that it's probably time to start opposing the king by force of arms. The open hostilities begin in the middle of 1642, and after a few opening skirmishes, the first true pitched battle of the English Civil War takes place at Edgehill on 23 October. Charles has no military training or experience of which to speak, but kings were still expected to lead their armies in the field in those days, and during the early part of the war he has a rather surprising amount of success, but it doesn't last. The victories grow fewer and the setbacks more numerous until the final crushing defeat at the Battle of Naseby on 14 June 1645. The king's military situation has collapsed utterly, and he lives on the run until April of 1646, traveling in disguise, sleeping in barns and cellars until he gets well and truly sick of the whole thing and voluntarily submits himself to the captivity of the Scottish Presbyterian army during the siege of Newark. It's likely he expected more humane treatment from the Scots than he was probably going to get from Cromwell and the Roundheads, but in the event, the Scots saw themselves an opportunity to make a whole shitload of money for themselves by ransoming the king to the English parliamentarians, which they proceeded to do after 9 months of negotiation, in return for the quite princely sum of £100,000. Now there develops a schism between Parliament and the New Model Army, both of whom believe the king rightly ought to be in their custody and not the custody of the other guys. So the king's confinement shifts from place to place. He's held first at Northamptonshire, then Newmarket, then Oatlands, and then finally at Hampton Court Palace, from which he unsuccessfully escapes, or attempts to escape, on 11 November 1647. Actually, that's not right. He does make a successful escape. He manages to get all the way to the Isle of Wight, where he's hopeful of being offered sanctuary by the territorial governor there, except, whoopsie, the Isle of Wight is now under the control of the parliamentarians instead of the royalists. So the king is swiftly re-imprisoned on the Isle of Wight in Carisbrooke Castle. He remains there for about a year, up until the latter part of 1648, when he is removed back to the mainland, first to Hurst Castle, then to Windsor Castle. In January of 1649, the Rump House of Commons, which by this time has been purged of all its members who are remotely sympathetic to the king, indicts Charles for treason. The House of Lords, for its part, rejects the indictment out of hand and washes its hands of the whole affair. So to all intents and purposes, the king's fate is now exclusively in the hands of his most rabid enemies. But there exists no mechanism in English law for putting a king on trial. All three of the chief justices of the common law courts reject the indictment as unlawful and refuse to hear the case. So the House of Commons simply conjures a new court into existence out of thin air, which they name the High Court of Justice, whose members they choose amongst themselves, and whose sole purpose is to conduct this one trial for this one defendant. On the first day of the trial, the king is asked to enter a plea. He refuses, on the not unreasonable grounds that he wants it explained to him by what lawful authority he is being put on trial. The commissioners have no good answer, because there isn't one, so they proceed as if a plea of guilty has been entered, which is the way criminal cases were tried back in those days. Actually, that's not quite true. The normal procedure, when a defendant refused to enter a plea, was to strap him to the floor, place a large board across his chest, and apply heavy stones on top of it until the defendant either entered a plea or expired from suffocation. And death was seen as God's signal that the guy really was guilty of the crime. But they chose not to subject Charles to this treatment, probably because they didn't really want him dead. The king never enters a plea, and the only time he speaks at length during the trial, he says the following, quote, "No earthly power can justly call me, who am your king, in question as a delinquent. This day's proceeding cannot be warranted by God's laws, for on the contrary, the authority of obedience unto kings is clearly warranted and strictly commanded in both the Old and New Testament. For the law of this land, I am no less confident that no learned lawyer will affirm that an impeachment can lie against the king, they all going in his name, and one of their maxims is that the king can do no wrong. The higher house is totally excluded, and for the House of Commons, it is all too well known that the major part of them are detained or deterred from sitting. The arms I took up were only to defend the fundamental laws of this kingdom against those who have supposed my power hath totally changed the ancient government." Close quote. In the legal sense, there is no way to describe the proceeding against King Charles except as a show trial and a kangaroo court, for it fits both descriptors quite well indeed. In this way, it's not so much dissimilar to the current proceedings in New York City against another deposed chief executive of a different country. The rule of law is trampled underfoot, all institutional norms are casually tossed aside, there remains not even a feeble veneer of judicial legitimacy, because all such concerns have been subordinated to the jealous desire to bring down this one man and make him pay. Not necessarily for any actual crimes he may have committed, but pay for being who and what he is. Pay for what he represents. And today, just as 370-odd years ago, the people doing the persecuting haven't spared a single thought for what comes after should they succeed. But can you rehabilitate the rule of law after you've chosen to discard it outright? Can you reinvigorate institutional norms after you have tossed them into the garbage? No, you can't. This is the rough equivalent of tearing down your own house in order to evict an unwanted tenant, and we will all of us, be paying the price for it for the remainder of our natural-born lives. And then our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren will pay the price for it, just because a small group of people decided that one man was intolerable. The parliamentarians, as I mentioned earlier, they didn't think King Charles was really going to be executed, even after they passed a death sentence on him, because they assumed he was a coward and a weakling who would eventually plead for clemency, which they, of course, planned on granting. But when the plea never came, and the man's head was well and truly severed, only then did they realize they had no plan for what came after. Do we abolish the monarchy, or do we get ourselves a new king? How do we pass laws without the royal assent that the law requires? So you get 11 years of chaos and nonsense and total ineptitude and near anarchy. They have to invent one ad hoc new form of government, the protectorate, and then a second one, the Commonwealth, and the thing turns into such a complete shit show that by 1660, Parliament has to go hand in hand to Charles's son living in exile in France, begging him to come back and assume the throne. The moral of the story? Think long and hard before you decide to go start blowing up norms and institutions. When Charles II came to the throne in the First Stuart Restoration, part of the deal was that he would agree to not go after the people who fought on the parliamentarian side in the Civil War. But Charles says, "Nah, dude. The men who signed my father's death warrant, they are to be hunted down and killed. You want my ass on that throne? There's my one condition." And they were, in fact, hunted down and killed. The ones who were still alive, at any rate. The ones who were already dead, they were dug up out of their graves and posthumously executed, their rotted heads mounted on spikes across the street from Banqueting House, facing the spot of Charles I's execution. Anyway, just a few things to think about. We are never living in unprecedented times, no matter how fervently anybody insists that we are. Every single thing has a historical antecedent that should be considered in detail before any radical or revolutionary course of action is chosen and embarked upon. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time. Have a pleasant tomorrow. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.